What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 127, and I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today, I'm joined by Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing, buddy?
I'm great, Kyle. How are you, man? Thanks for having me on.
Doing well, and I'm sure the audience knows you by now. You're a writer at the Libertarian Institute, so libertarianinstitute.org to find pretty much everything me and Connor are working on. Or you could check out Connor's shirt there and go to antiwar.com, and especially the viewpoints where I'm putting that together every day. So, Connor, thanks for coming back on. I think we got a great lineup for today. We got this big story about Afghanistan, the government there possibly falling in 6 to 12 months, some unnamed officials are saying. And then, of course, a big incident in the Black Sea between the UK and Russia. So, everybody be sure to share today's show. You can find it at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for a full archive of my work. We put the show on all of our social media accounts at Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter. You can find the show video version on YouTube or Odysee, and you can support the show at Patreon or Subscribestar. And then we also are now posting the show on the blog at antiwar.com. You can also support the show by getting yourself some great CBD products through Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com is the URL. They have a wide selection of CBD products and infused with different kinds of additives like melatonin to help you get to sleep. I really like their topicals. I've been using their sports cream quite a lot. Now that I'm back from my vacation, I couldn't bring it on the plane because, of course, this ridiculous 3-ounce rule that the TSA still has going on. But now that I'm back, I've been back using it, and I do feel better every morning, and I do get that nice punch menthol smell to help me wake up. So everybody check out PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Use the promo code PEACE, PEACE. That gets you 25% off when you spend $75 or more. All right, Connor, let's get right to this with this Wall Street Journal story. And I mean, it sounds maybe a little bit sensational. They're saying that Kabul, the, I guess, central government that we built up in Afghanistan, when they say Kabul, that's what they mean. And the Afghan Army could fall apart within the next 6 to 12 months after a U.S. pullout. So I guess that would, put us probably on the timetable they're talking about, between spring and fall of next year. But what did you make of this story? And of course, one of the big things that I noted was this is being said by unnamed U.S. officials. And so, do you think this is an accurate assessment of what's going on in Afghanistan, or if this is maybe them trying to play up a need for the U.S. to stay longer?
I think it's both. So there's been so before like Biden postponed the May withdrawal and made the situation much worse than it needed to be. The Taliban already controlled 50% of the country. Now there's about 400 districts in Afghanistan, and the Taliban had not made a move so much against those districts, 370 of which are controlled by Kabul. And since May 1st through, I think, June 14th, the Taliban took 34 districts. Then I believe last week they got another dozen, including 4 in just Wednesday. So if you read a lot of analysts like Moon of Alabama, he's saying that he sees this Kabul falling potentially in the next several months. So I don't think it's inaccurate. They've gotten the Taliban seized a border town with Tajikistan, about 50 kilometers from Kunduz, which is also their capital city is under. I'm not sure if it's been fully captured, but it's heavily contested right now. And the Taliban seems to be making massive gains in Kunduz and Farab province in the northwest. And these are not Pashtun areas. These are not areas that these are mostly populated with like Uzbeks and Tajiks and groups that aren't friendly to the Taliban. But the thing is so Kabul's military, we've all known, is very. I mean, the U.S. has poured trillions of dollars into this government and its military since the 20-year war began. They are virtually helpless without U.S. support. whether it's through the contractors or air support or the forces we have on the ground. And so what's happening now is as the Taliban moves in to take these districts, you've got hundreds of Afghan soldiers just surrendering because the Taliban is willing to, if they surrender, they won't harm them, and they give them enough money to go home, and then they take all their equipment, their trucks, other vehicles, and their guns and ammunition, and then they use them to take further districts. So it's yeah, there's this other story about, in I believe in Farab province, they took this district called Dawalat al Abad, which is this is very controversial. The special forces feel like they got betrayed. They were sent in to take these commandos who were U.S. trained were sent in to take a district back from the Taliban. They were counting on reinforcements. Nearly 200 soldiers and police were going to follow them. They were supposed to get air support. The forces that were supposed to come and help them never left their bases, and the air support never arrived. Actually, and so now, that's only going to make matters worse for Kabul because, if you needed any more incentive to just surrender to the Taliban, there you go. Half of them were killed within an hour, half of these commandos. So, they're not putting up much of a fight. Another thing that Bernard talks about in his blog at Moon of Alabama in this article is about how the helicopters that Kabul has, these Black Hawk helicopters from the U.S., they're much more complicated, expensive, and difficult to maintain for the Afghan forces compared to their old Soviet helicopters, which they can actually maintain themselves. But of course, our Congress, acting on behalf of our military-industrial complex years ago, made sure that Kabul bought American and didn't get any more of those Russian helicopters. And so what's happening now is that these Black Hawks are being grounded, and they can't pretty soon there won't be any left to fly. And even though they probably still have a few, they weren't sent to go and help these commandos. So what's happening is the Taliban is basically coming outside these districts and seizing checkpoints and security strongholds on the outside. Once they do that, they beseech the police and the military, like where their main security forces are, and then they send in tribal elders to basically negotiate and explain what I just said, which is that essentially if they register their names with the Taliban and surrender and hand over their stuff, that they'll have enough, they won't be harmed, and they can go home. Yeah, it's just, I'm not surprised at all that this is happening. Like I said, we knew that the Afghan military is not equipped to defend itself. This has been just a complete disaster of a war. But at the same time, like you said, I think that whole reality is just going to be played up, especially to domestic audiences and to probably NATO, that, well, now we can't leave. And in fact, we're already hearing that basically, like, we're hearing, I think it was John Kirby, the Pentagon spokesman, saying, well, we may just slow the withdrawal. And they call it a retrograde because they don't want to actually call it a withdrawal because it's embarrassing. But they say, actually, what I thought was really notable was the statement was, if we need to change the scope of the retrograde. I can find out the exact quote, but basically they're suggesting that, hey, we might just change the plan. And I'm assuming that even though this all seems accurate, this report, it's going to be used to further make it more difficult for Biden to just leave, and to even leave by September 11th. We're supposed to leave. There were reports that they were going to leave by the middle of July, middle of next month, because a lot of our allies are leaving because they're fearing more Taliban attacks, which seems to be on the money.
Right, so this Taliban tactic is pretty interesting. It's not the most brutal way to handle this situation. I'm not saying that there's not significant fighting going on the ground in Afghanistan, and that, at times the Taliban still aren't committing, like, atrocities or things like that. But the idea that they would, surround the town and then give the people a chance to surrender and not even take them as POWs, but just send them back home is... at least, a way to like kind of start to solve some of the problems in
Hmm.
Afghanistan. I'm not saying it's ideal because they're surrendering a bunch of equipment, military equipment to the Taliban, but at the same time, maybe this will prompt the Afghan government to look at withdrawing back to areas of the country that they can more easily control without giving up a bunch of equipment. I also think you'll see situations like, we saw unfold with those commandos where either the central government's unable to or the troops are unwilling to go out on rescue missions and stuff like that, be reinforcements into these areas that are more heavily Taliban areas. And so we may see that the battle lines kind of get drawn by the individual's decisions made, the circumstances on the ground. And not that that's not going to come with some bloodshed, but there may be ways that could come with less. And I really wish the U.S., as you say, they're starting to look at changing their slowing the withdrawal, what they're calling it, which means extending the war, rather than trying to find opportunities to allow territory to be swapped without bloodshed on the way out the door. I think would be a lot smarter. Now, I just want to highlight that helicopter story really quick because it's just one of those things. It's one little, just like story of the Afghan war, and there's thousands of these stories probably. But the Americans don't want the Afghan government buying the old Soviet made, now Russia made helicopters, right? So they forced them to buy Black Hawks, even though it took like 15 years to train the Afghan army to fit the old Soviet helicopters that they had. And they finally had that done. Then they're like, oh no, now we got to train them on the Black Hawks. And it's a real problem because the one real advantage that the Afghan army has over the Taliban, other than the funding and backing of the United States and NATO, is their air power. If you remove both sides, the one thing that they would be able to do is have air power, and the Taliban don't have that. And so when you have a helicopter and you can shoot at people on the ground, there is an advantage to that, right? And that they can't maintain this, and they're talking about this ridiculous plan to bring the Black Hawks to Qatar, and they already have the additional issue that the US can't even buy the spare parts for those helicopters for the Afghan army because the US is sanctioning Russia and their Russian
Right.
made parts. And so India has to be the third party middleman to make that happen. And so it's just such a disaster, and just shows how much of a failure that this war has been after 20 years. And I guess, Connor, now we're at the point where you after 20 years of sunk costs, we have failure in Afghanistan. Now, to me and you, this is all more reason just to leave. But the way the narrative has been built, the way the American ego and kind of emotional reaction has been shaped by the U.S. media, when we talk about this, people almost take it as ammunition that we're saying to extend the war, to stay in longer, because if we leave, this thing is all going to fall apart. And yeah, it seems more and more like that may be the case, that when we leave, this gets bad, and not in too long of a time stretch. It may
Yeah.
not be 12 months. They may not have that decent interval that they were looking for, right? That's from the Vietnam example. That after the U.S. withdrew, it's not like they withdrew and a week later they were helicoptering the people out of the U.S. embassy. That was a couple of years after. And so I think ideally Joe Biden would have liked to finish his first term, or maybe have even left office before the government in Kabul falls, and either we're abandoning our embassy in Kabul, or we're helicoptering the people out of there in another absurd situation like that. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if not, and not continue. Then let's talk about the situation at the airport, the Kabul airport, and who's going to provide security there.
Well, I think it's related because which they they claim they want to stay to protect the embassy and diplomatic offices, um, and so they want to see a big part of this is securing the airport. That's the ostensible reason for trying to maintain forces there. But what we're finding out is so the Doha deal is about getting the U.S. and all other foreign troops out of Afghanistan, but NATO and well, anyway, especially the Americans don't want to leave Afghanistan to the Afghans. So we have a problem here, of course. So one of the things that they're doing in order to find a way to stay, because I think it's related to the fact that they're having such difficulty getting the bases that they want, CIA bases in Pakistan, bases in the northern Central Asian countries, and they haven't been able to pull that off. So they're running out of options other than to just base things out of the Persian Gulf on bases there and aircraft carriers. So one of the things that they're talking about is Turkey has about, I think it's like 500 troops guarding the Kabul airport right now, the Hamid Karzai airport. And the U.S. wants them to stay there and guard it. And one of the, now here's what's interesting is I think the Turks want sanctions relief for their purchases of S-400 anti for their S-400 systems from their missile defense systems from Russia, and the U.S. sanctioned Ankara for that. So now I'm sure they're working out some sort of a deal, but I think there's probably at an impasse because we saw reports today that said Turkey is saying they're not going to send in more troops to protect the airport. Viktor Orban, the leader of Hungary, is trying to get. Apparently, they have 9 troops in Afghanistan right now. Hungary does, and they want to. They used to have 150, and they're going. We guarded the airport. We helped out in 2010 to 2013, so they're offering to help with. To help the Turks do this because they want to show NATO that they can really get stuff done and be a useful asset to the alliance. But what's interesting is, of course, the Taliban have repeatedly said that this whole plan is unacceptable, completely unacceptable. You'll be viewed as invaders if you stay past the deadline. And the thing is like if they want to go ahead and make this move, we just had another report out today that said from the White House that said no U.S. troops have been killed since the deal was signed in February of last year. Well, that could easily change, because after the Taliban made these statements about how they're not going to accept this, we had Jake Sullivan come out and say that, no, Biden and Erdogan already talked about it, and we're not going to be deterred by your threats. So we take it seriously, but we're not really seriously. He's saying they're just going to go ahead and do it. But Moon of Alabama was talking about how this could be they're wanting to keep drones there to protect the airport, and that could be a way to have basically to maintain some level of air support there. They also he also speculates that it could have something to do with the Uyghurs who are being used by the U.S. and Turkey, whether it's in Syria. They've also been aided through Afghanistan. Our friend, the great Pat McFarland, talks about this in his article about the Uyghurs. So it's and of course Larry Wilkerson, former Colin Powell's chief of staff, has talked to Scott Horton about this. So it's suspicious. The CIA desperately wants to be there, but the Pakistanis have already told them that absolutely not. We're not doing this. In fact, Imran Khan specifically said absolutely not, and it was trending. And the Pakistanis are very pleased with that because they don't want any more involvement in this war. And recently, the U.S. in I want to say the beginning of May used Pakistani airspace to launch airstrikes in Helmand province against the Taliban. And they used this, they requested access for, I think it's called the Shamsi airfield. And the U.S. was based out of there from 2001 to 2011. The Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Affairs told, I forget what the committee was exactly, but he was saying basically we've been granted overflight and access by the Pakistanis, and this did not play well domestically in Pakistan. So now it looks like the Pakistanis, the Chinese have talked to the Pakistanis, according to Moon of Alabama, because they need an IMF loan right now, and the U.S. was standing in the way of them getting this loan, probably trying to extract concessions from Pakistan over this issue. And now the Chinese apparently have relieved them of that and probably are aiding them because they don't want the CIA anywhere near Afghanistan for exactly what we were just talking about. So, but it seems like the airport issue could lead to a much wider war, and it could just end up provoking the Taliban and being used as a casus belli.
Right. Now, one important thing in all of this, maybe some good news to wrap up the Afghan topic today, is that the White House says there still haven't been any attacks on U.S. troops, and that goes back to February of 2020. And so this is good news that as much as there has been a Taliban offensives in Afghanistan, they have avoided targeting any American or other international forces. And I guess there could come a time where maybe the only foreign forces in Afghanistan are the Turkish soldiers at the Kabul airport, and maybe some kind of deal could be reached with the Taliban at that time. But it definitely seems like the Taliban are going to keep a hardline public stance on that leading up until that point, and so I think it would. It does well for Americans to remember that no soldiers have died as long as we're on this committed path to leaving this country. And, that's the way we keep Americans safe, is to stay on that path. Connor, anything else on Afghanistan before we get into this major incident in the Black Sea?
Yeah, well, actually, yeah, I'd want to add a few quotes from some of our politicians who are trying to extend the war. So the Taliban have said that when they heard about this plan, they put out a statement that said the security of diplomatic offices, embassies, airports, that is the responsibility of solely of the Afghans. And I mean, I understand that the Hawks don't want that to be, they don't want to make that concession. But like you were saying, the Taliban is not going about reclaiming this territory in as brutal of a fashion as they could if they wanted to. So if we wouldn't provoke them so much by threatening to extend the war, and which has really hurt the prospects of the Doha talks, the intra-Afghan talks, it's very possible that, look, I mean, if the Taliban can maintain security for those positions, I mean, it seems like that would be something to not just rule out of hand. So, I mean, but what's interesting is we have Mark Milley telling Congress that last week, it's the president's intent to keep the embassy open, to keep our security forces around the embassy, and to continue to work with the Afghan government to continue to fund Afghan security forces and keep the situation from devolving into the worst case. And that's what we're planning on. That's what we're working toward. That is completely contradictory to the Doha talks, to the peace, the withdrawal deal that was agreed to between the U.S. and the Taliban. We are not supposed to be interfering in their internal affairs, and they are to make sure that that no groups use Afghan soil to launch attacks against the United States. But if the United States is going to maintain its war there, then they will defend themselves and they will attack these forces. And what I'm concerned about is that's when it'll be just obvious to everybody that we can't leave now. We have to go back to war and probably escalate. So, they're still debating whether or not the U.S. will provide airstrikes or air support if Kabul and Kandahar City seriously come under threat from the Taliban. That could be a big problem. And we have, let's see. So James Inhofe, who's a GOP senator, he's ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal where he says he's saying Biden should leave a small force of about 1,000 troops in Afghanistan until at least the spring of 2022, which is just, that's guaranteed to get Americans killed, essentially. And I'll just say that Ashraf Ghani, the current president of Afghanistan, is headed to the U.S. To Washington to speak to Biden at the end of this week. I'm assuming he's not going to say anything that we would like to hear. And also, I'll just say that Hamid Karzai surprisingly actually came out and said we would be better off without a U.S. military presence. He said, I think we should defend our country and look after our own lives. Their presence has given us what we have now. We don't want to continue with this misery and indignity that we are facing. It is better for Afghanistan that they leave. And that's absolutely true. I mean, more than 100,000 people have been killed in this war. Probably a lot more than that we don't even know about. We're just going to continue to destroy this country with this civil war for what? For the defense industry to keep presence there to check China and Russia. It's unconscionable. But it's not it's looking to me like they're putting a lot of things in place where it'll be politically expedient, and they'll make it a situation where they can just keep the war going because, hey, we got attacked.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on to this situation that happened in the Black Sea between Russia and a UK naval ship. From what I understand, is the first time since the Cold War that Russia has used live fire to deter a NATO ship, from advancing into what Russia, identifies as Russian territorial waters. And so, Connor, do you want to kind of explain the details of what happened here? And I understand that Russia is very serious about this, and they're trying to make it known that they're very serious about this, because they, went a little bit further and dropped bombs, not, I guess, anywhere to hit the ship, but to just let the ship know, like, hey, you're coming to a line where there will be live bombs fired at you. And some in the UK ambassador are attache to Russia. So what's going on?
Well, so the Defender Europe 21 exercises just wrapped up, which were the biggest exercises since biggest NATO military exercises since the end of the Cold War, and they all happened essentially in Eastern Europe on Russia's border. We talked about this in a previous episode. And this actually really formed the backdrop for all the tensions, particularly in April over Ukraine, late March and April. And now that that's over, on June 28th, only 4 days from now, they're going to launch a new drill called Sea Breeze, which is a massive exercise with 32 countries from 6 different continents. Now, this ship, this guided, I believe it's a guided missile destroyer that was sent. It's part of the HMS Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier group. And it is going into it, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, it sailed with 3 kilometers into the territorial sea near Cape Fiolent in Crimea and crossed the state border of the Russian Federation in the northwestern part of the Black Sea. So, yeah, I mean, this is deliberately provocative. They're essentially saying that they don't recognize the Russian claim over Crimea, the annexation, which was, of course, in response to the coup and the threats made to the Sevastopol base, where Russia has had a base forever, and now it's their sole warm water base. And so now we have a situation where basically they come in at like 11:52 in the afternoon, and it takes like, I don't know, 15 minutes or so. But these ships from the Russian Black Sea Fleet and their border guard service warned them repeatedly to leave the waters. They fired warning shots, and still there was no response. Then they had a actual Su-24M plane, which is a Russian bomber, that dropped 4 OFAB 250 bombs along the right of the Defender, this destroyer. And they left 4 minutes after that. The defense ministers, the Russian defense minister, summoned the attaché of the British embassy in Moscow to discuss this. And what's interesting actually is that last week the U.S. was holding these. The U.S. has their 5th warship in the Black Sea so far this year. Which is it's called the USS Laboon. It's a guided missile interceptor missile destroyer, and they came into the Black Sea last week with a frigate from the Netherlands, the HNLMS Everston, and they entered with the Defender, and they were conducting drills there last week. So, and these other ships that the U.S. has already sent in there, they have, they're the Aegis combat system vessels, which have standard missile 3 interceptor missiles to shoot down, Russian missiles if they want to, or at least ostensibly, and they're capable of firing 55 Tomahawk cruise missiles. So just, I always try to imagine, what would this be like if the Russians were doing this in the Gulf of Mexico? Would we, we wouldn't stand for it. Of course not. But we're always, the HMS Queen Elizabeth is being sent around getting in on this whole new anti-China pivot, the Asia pivot. They're sailing around goading, particularly China and Russia, and it's a big show of force. And it's also not boding well for these exercises that are coming up, these sea breeze exercises, which Russia is already requesting that they do not, that U.S. and NATO do not go through with these exercises. But I guarantee you that won't happen.
Right. So, Connor, one thing I just want to clarify on the actual, I guess, unfolding of the situation was initially I saw that the UK government put out that they said that the fire wasn't directed at the ship and that it was part of a separate naval exercise that Russia was doing. And so I thought that was like a very odd response, right? Like I think me and you kind of both expect the the Western countries to kind of throw their hands in the air and start screaming, "Oh my God, Russia shot at one of the Queen's ships. How dare they do that?" And all this other stuff. And their reaction was rather than that was to pretend like it didn't happen at all and to
Yeah,
say
to
nah
just deny
they
it.
were doing some other stuff. Yeah, the neighbors were shooting, but they were they just had a wedding, they were popping off some rounds in the air, even though. And so it's a very interesting way to phrase what happened there. Do you have any idea of why they responded this way, or if it sometimes international events happen?
I think, well, I think they're, what's interesting is, I feel like this happens a lot. So if you check on, when Dave DeCamp is constantly reporting on the phone ops in the South China Sea, and when Western countries sail warships through the Taiwan Strait, if if Russia or China intercept these vessels or these planes, uh, the it's not always, but I've noticed a pattern where they will just say we didn't leave because they forced us to. It's almost like it's like how Andrew Basovich just had a piece recently about this called "Whistling Past the Afghan Graveyard," just about all the different euphemisms the military uses to basically obfuscate the fact that they're withdrawing in defeat from Afghanistan. There's a lot of you know pride built into them denying, like, we didn't leave because they dropped a bomber dropped 4 bombs in front of our course. We would have been glad. It was just, I mean,
No,
that's
this
what
this
I
makes
see
a
it
lot of
coming.
sense. That it's a face saving thing, right? If
Yeah.
you went, onto your like neighbor's front porch and they were like, take another step and see what happens, then like you know how you are. You're a guy. Like sometimes you're like, I'm gonna take another step, do something about it. Even if you're clearly in the wrong in the first place. And but you don't assume that that happens on the international scale. You would think that governments aren't supposed to interact with like male testosterone, reactivity and aggression. It's supposed to be principled and calculated and tactical and strategic, not in any way. So it's very interesting, but that's what they had to do. I guess that's what they have to do to save face. Now, anything else on that particular incident? Because there's other things going on with Russia that aren't maybe as important. They're not going to grab as many headlines, but the U.S. after Biden met with Putin is now planning more sanctions on Russia. So, I mean, this is, I think, a slap in the face to Russia.
Yeah, I look at it as a part of the larger campaign. Um, and really, it's a rejection of what we thought was, or at least I did, was moderately good news after the summit with Putin. I'll just point out that before we move on from the Black Sea stuff, that so I mentioned the Netherlands frigate, and you have the British there and the Americans. That in early March they had that drill near Kaliningrad, where the US F-15s were conducting drills with the militaries of Poland, the Netherlands, and Britain, and they were doing like mock missile firings at Kaliningrad. So it's I mean, this has been going on for months. I mean, shortly after Biden came into office, he sent an aircraft carrier group and into the South China Sea, and He's already sent warships into the Taiwan Strait 6 times. Immediately sent. Virtually immediately sent warships into the Black Sea. Multiple provocations. So, I mean, this is part of the new, whatever, the great power competition policy of the military. And it looks like we're just, I mean, especially under Biden, I don't, again, we're getting into his sort of the about face after the whole, what we thought was, actually a pretty conciliatory meeting between he and Putin. Putin had some nice things to say about Biden. Biden kind of rejected some of the hawkish, attacks on him from our mainstream media, castigating him for not taking a tougher position on Navalny, and how come you didn't, punish Putin, or how can you trust him? He's a killer or whatever. I mean, actually, Biden's the one who called him a killer a few months ago, but it's the same sort of thing. They make sure that the relations. I mean, like, we cannot thaw these. We cannot thaw the new Cold War. It can only get worse, and relations have to be permanently frozen, and they have to ramp up tensions. And so, they had this meeting. They were supposed to be talks. It was supposed to be like 4 or 5 hours. Ended up being like 2 hours long. This is the summit in Geneva between Putin and Biden. Especially after everything that went on with Ukraine and those massive exercises I referenced earlier, we're all, I think sane people everywhere were hoping for some good news out of this. Now, they discussed that they would start talks soon on, strategic stability and negotiations over nuclear weapons, especially after Trump left the Open Skies Treaty. Russia offered early on into Biden's administration. They said, we're ready to start renegotiations on open skies if you are. This was after the first phone call Biden made with Putin, where they extended New START for 5 years, which is very good. But New START is the last real arms control agreement left standing after Trump. And then shortly after Russia made that offer, we heard from the State Department that they were not going to try and re-enter open skies. But we heard from Putin and Biden in this meeting that they were going to pursue talks on not only strategic stability, but also cyber warfare, which has become a real big issue, especially with our domestic media blaming anything that goes wrong in America, any ransomware, any problems with our infrastructure. It's all Russian attacks. And they don't have to provide any evidence, and it gets people all riled up. They said that there may be talk on exchanging prisoners. And so we actually heard some good things. They sent our ambassador. Russia agreed to return its ambassador to Washington. The Biden agreed to return our ambassador to Moscow. And these are like basic things. So it looked like, Putin had said it was constructive. The deputy foreign minister, I believe, of Russia was saying, we would like to enter in these talks right away. We're supposed to be doing it in the next couple of weeks. And then I think the weekend of the discussion, it was on like a Wednesday on the 16th, Jake Sullivan came out and announced new sanctions on Russia for Navalny and the imprisonment of Navalny. They said once we get the right targets, we'll issue the sanctions. And they also said we have more sanctions coming for alleged chemical weapons violations. So, I mean, if you turn into the mainstream media, by the way, they really hammered Biden for being even the slightest bit reasonable with Putin and the Russians, and it's just incredible. I feel like this is, Biden said if we're going to see how the next few months go, if Russia can actually basically be adults about this, and we'll see where things go. But the bureaucracy has stepped in and made sure that the U.S. is actually going to just destroy prospects now, it seems like, especially with all these other confrontations.
Right. No, this is so important because, as you say, it's not like Biden and Putin came to any big agreement, but at the same time, it wasn't a disaster. They got along. They agreed to some nice things. But this is like, as they're leaving the room, Sullivan like giving Putin the finger on the way out the door. It's not going to do anything to change Russian behavior. It's not going to get Navalny out of prison. And to be honest, if we're talking about freeing political prisoners, let's start with the long list of political prisoners, with Julian Assange and, the now deceased John McAfee. Daniel Hale is now in jail. And so many people in U.S. prisons are there for essentially potentially political reasons. Anybody who stands up to the state by leaking documents. And so if we're worried about the, let's pursue that, but let's, not do it in a hypocritical way. And that's exactly what they're doing. And so, it's not about human rights, Connor. Jake Sullivan, Joe Biden, they don't care about human rights. It's about being able to stick a finger in the eye of Putin on the way out the door to let him know that things aren't actually changing. That we had a nice meeting, that we're going to, tape things, we're going to dial down the tensions, the heat a little bit, but we want you to know that, you still have to be on notice and we're still prepared. Now, I would like to move on and start talking about Iran because there's a lot of important stuff going on there. I know there's so much with Russia too, but we had this story in the past week, and I want to add a little bit of clarity to it because I think when I saw it first reported, and a lot of people on Twitter were saying it wrong, saying that the U.S. had seized the website of Press TV. They didn't actually seize the servers and the content. They seized domain names, but I believe 33 in total were seized this past week by the Justice Department in I guess they say it's because they are violating sanctions, these websites. And they weren't just Iranian websites, but they were websites within... I hate using the word the Iranian orbit or the Iranian allies because that's, saying the Houthis are Iran, Hezbollah is Iran, Hamas is Iran. But to say, these were a part of the, the groups are the people most targeted by the U.S. and the empire in the Middle East. So that is the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran. And the result of this is very interesting because it comes, Connor, just after reports from the Iranians, even after an Iranian hardliner was just elected, that we were moving very close to a deal. They said that the U.S. had agreed to lift 2/3 of the Trump era sanctions, including those on shipping and on oil. And so this was potentially a breakthrough. And then these sanctions on the Iranian website are very, seem to be, more directed at the public, right? Because Press TV still exists, but for if you're an Iranian citizen and you see that the U.S. government has the power to take down domain names of Iranian websites, that's pretty crazy. So let's anywhere you want to start with this whole. We have a bunch of stuff on Iran, but I think it's also tied together. It's hard to ask you a question about one specific thing, but go ahead.
No, I hear it. Well, it's not too it's almost analogous to what we're talking about with Russia. By the way, you knew that something was going to go wrong when you saw Victoria Nuland sitting at the table for those talks with the Russians. That was bad news from the beginning. But with Iran, they have this new, first of all, the guy's a conservative judge who is supposedly linked. I mean, I'm not disputing it. I don't know enough about it, but to some human rights abuses in the late 80s, brutal crackdown on dissidents. But of course, this was during the what is this? The late 80s. The U.S. was backing Iraq in launching massive chemical weapons attacks against the Iranians. Brutal war where Israel backed Iran back when they were allies still, and the U.S. backed Iraq. 1 million people died in that war, half on both sides. So it's not surprising that this guy has a history of anti-U.S. sentiment or whatever. But the truth is that so far it doesn't look like he's that radical. I mean, a lot of his policies are actually similar to the moderates in the sense of he supports returning to the Iran deal. He wants sanctions relief. He says that if the U.S. Lifts sanctions, that they'll return to the deal, just like the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has repeated again and again and again. I mean, the idea that, because we've got a hardliner in there, it's going to be really difficult. Well, actually, it'll just make it easier for the U.S. to provoke Iran, and maybe this new government won't be as patient and won't accept such limited sanctions relief when Biden refuses to lift all the Trump era sanctions, of which there are well over 1,000.
Can I just make a quick point, Connor? Because one of the talking points people are pointing to kind of say that this guy is like a particular hardliner or something is that he's ruled out talking with Biden directly. But this is the position of the current Iranian president, Rouhani, who's the moderate. And so it's, as you point out, just another example of the Iranian policy isn't changing that much. And that was just one example people kept pointing to. And I mean, it seems to be the same policy. That's why all the talks right now in Geneva are indirect, is because Iran is saying we're not going to give you direct talks until you return to the deal. And so this is just a continuation, as far as I see it, of the Rouhani policy.
Yeah, I totally agree. The Americans essentially they don't treat Iran like a country worthy of respect. So I'm not. I believe I read here in Trita Parsi's piece that we're looking at now that Rouhani didn't meet with Obama either, and I believe I read from it was either Jason or Jason Ditz or Dave Decamp at antiwar.com that the Americans have said before that they don't believe it's worth. We don't even. Why talk to the Iranian president? He's not really in charge anyway. It's the Ayatollah that's the real shot caller. So yeah, I mean the Iranians don't get any respect, even though they've made, just agreeing to even discuss this further when Biden has continued the maximum pressure campaign. You have the Israelis launching covert attacks on the Natanz nuclear program, killing their scientists like Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in November. Uh, constantly making threats to Iran. Biden has even imposed sanctions since he came into office on Iran, appointing Richard Nephew, the of Art of Sanctions fame, this huge hawk who's really proud of how difficult he made it for Iranians to obtain food, for example, during the holidays with his sanctions policies. He's now the deputy Iran envoy. We covered that a few shows ago. Max Blumenthal's piece about this guy at the Gray Zone. They're continuing the maximum pressure campaign. And we just saw reports that said not only that they took these sites domains down, the .coms, and of course you can still reach the if you use .ir, you can still reach like Press TV. They've since put up, if you use the .ir at the end of the URL, you can see the English version of Press TV. And it's interesting because the Office of Foreign Asset Control actually said, they go, well, it's a malign influence operation. They're disguising themselves as a media outlet. I'm pretty sure I've seen Daniel McAdams on that show. I know Jason Ditz of antiwar.com has been on Press TV before. I know Ryan Dawson has appeared on Press TV. So, in many cases, just like RT, it's a platform for voices you won't hear on mainstream American news because, frankly, it's I mean, when are you going to see Dan McAdams interviewed on Fox News? You're not. So because our media is, even if it's corporate or whatever, it's just as controlled. And of course, we have all kinds of so-called, if you want to turn it around, malign operations going on through Voice of America and all of our state-funded media we use for, psychological operations overseas. But, like you were saying, these states that they took, they call themselves the axis of resistance. I always dispute the claim when people say like Yemen is a proxy war. Iran is not. I haven't seen any evidence to conclusively prove that Iran is providing physical weapons to the Yemenis. I mean, how would they get it through the blockade, to the Houthis, I should say? How would they get it through the U.S.-Saudi blockade there that's starving, 400,000 children to death this year, potentially. But I mean, yeah, I mean, these are political allies. It's interesting that this happened at the same time that we have this big delegation from the IDF visiting Washington, led by the IDF Chief of Staff, Aviv Kohavi, who's putting a lot of pressure on the Biden administration in their first big delegation sent over since the new Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, took power. It's not a coincidence, I don't think, that this all happened at the same time. Gantz recently threatened, as we have on the screen now, to that all options are on the table. We'll attack, if we want to, Iran's nuclear program. He was speaking to former U.S. military officials who were there who were in Israel with the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, which is another hawkish think tank from Washington. So. And they're talking about, where we have basically they're using the same rap we've talked about before, which is that where Israel comes out and goes, oh, you can't make this deal. It paves the way for an Iranian nuclear military program, and we're discussing ways to prevent that from happening. That's why, this delegation is here to talk with Pentagon officials. And it's just absurd because anybody who's being honest and anybody who knows the first thing about this, the Iranians have never had a nuclear weapons program. Gareth Porter has done extensive work on that. When they talk about, recently the new Mossad chief was threatening, if they go back to the deal or whatever, we're going to launch all kinds of covert attacks and assassinations. And the outgoing Mossad chief was saying how we penetrated in the heart of the enemy and revealed all their secrets. Well, all those, you remember when Netanyahu gave that ridiculous speech, one of many, on the eve of Trump withdrawing from the JCPOA, saying we discovered all these documents in Iran, we snuck in there and got them out of it. They were all still the same old forgeries from the MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq, which is a terrorist group that the U.S. and Israel back in Iran and were most likely involved in the assassination of this scientist last November. But anyway, this is just a continuation of the maximum pressure campaign. I don't think Biden sincerely wants to return to the deal, and they're just going to use the election of this guy Ibrahim Raisi to just be, more justification for continued aggression and threatening posture toward Iran. There's no, and also I was going to say Naftali Bennett is saying, I think the foreign minister, Yair Lapid, goes, I was against the deal and I'm still against it. I don't think Netanyahu used the right approach. So maybe this is a new approach. Every single one of those groups that they went after, whether it was Kataib Hezbollah, the Houthi media, that media outlet in Gaza, Press TV, all these are, except for the Houthis, Israel takes a position against them because they're a part of the resistance axis. But, these are all essentially enemies or friends of enemies of Israel.
Yeah. So I guess just kind of finish off here with the Iran part on the nuclear deal negotiations, because that is the most important thing. I don't know how much impact from the Iranian side the new president will have on changing the Iranian position. As you said, it's mostly the Ayatollah, and his position seemed consistent with the Ayatollah's positions on re-entering the deal, and those were the positions that Rouhani has had. So how much of a big deal is it going to make from the Iranian perspective? I don't know. But then it's going to be used in the U.S., particularly by the Republicans, to weaponize against the deal. And so, we keep having these statements from various groups involved, and it's often the Iranians, but not always. The Russians, the Chinese have come out and made statements suggesting that we may be close to a deal to return to the JCPOA, and then pretty much every time the U.S. will come out right after and do something, a few things. One, didn't say that that's not true. Meet with Israel, and then something will happen in or around Iran, or more sanctions or some diplomatic punishment from the U.S. to seem to send a signal to Iran that, look, we really mean it. We don't like you guys. And it's very interesting to see that happen through a negotiation. And so, what are your thoughts on, I guess I'm really leaning towards, and I have been all along, that deal's not going to get done. A couple weeks ago, I was starting to soften on that, but it seems to me, again, that it seems just so unlikely that the Biden administration is at all invested enough in this and making it happen. And with the, actions of the Republicans and the Israel and the Saudi lobbies, I just don't see this thing going through. But I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, during the whole war on Gaza, Marco Rubio came out and had that letter he sent to Biden that was signed off by more than 40 Republican lawmakers saying end the talks in Vienna and offer absolutely no sanctions relief. And, so that's the Republican position. They're going to push him to be hawkish on Iran and to negate diplomacy on every level. And they do not want to return to the Iran deal, of course. So they're in the bag for Israel in that respect. And they're really kind of their own unofficial lobby, I suppose, and certainly people like Marco Rubio are. So you've got, I don't think that bodes well. There's a working, there to your point about extracting further concessions. This was, Gareth Porter wrote a piece about how a few months ago about how this is Jake Sullivan's plan that he announced during the campaign, the presidential campaign, that they're going to use basically this coercive diplomacy to use the Trump sanctions as leverage to extract further concessions. And we covered this on the show. How they want to, ballistic missiles have to be on the table, and support for Iran's allies, their independent foreign policy, which not uncoincidentally has to do with these very groups who are connected to these outlets that were shut down. And so one of the things I picked up was, let me see if I could find it. There was a working group set up between Brett McGurk and Israel's deputy national security advisor. If people want to look this up, the article is U.S.-Israel Continue Close Coordination on Iran Nuclear Deal. Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. And he says, the U.S. and Israel are also coordinating on ways to counter Iranian drones and missiles, according to a report from Axios. The report said the U.S. and Israel established a working group to counter Iranian weapons that first met 3 weeks ago. The group is headed by Brett McGurk, the top Middle East official on the National Security Council, and Israel's deputy national security advisor, Revun Azar. Now, McGurk was the envoy to the anti-ISIS coalition who resigned in late 2018 in December when Trump said he wanted to withdraw from Syria, and very publicly, and that was used for PR against the idea of a withdrawal from Syria, of course. And McGurk is now as Dave said in the article, he's running Middle East policy at the National Security Council, and he's a pro-Israel hawk. His whole thing about Israel is that we need to stay there to defend the Kurds and to support Israel's bombing campaign of, so-called Iranian targets. They bomb Syria just about every week. Also, there's reports that Israel and the U.S. are coordinating in the last couple of months, which would fit in with the time frame when Biden started talking with, the indirect negotiations in Vienna, which would makes sense with what you're saying. They're increasing coordination to counter Iran with, Bahrain, the UAE, and other states that don't have agreements already, like official, like Abraham's Accord type normalization agreements with Israel. But it just seems like that's more of a way to threaten Iran and to further embolden that anti-Iran coalition in the Middle East and here in the States as well. So. We also have Rafael Grossi from the IAEA chief, who's saying, I wouldn't, because Zarif, the foreign minister, and the moderates want to try and get this deal done before the new government takes power in August. And that should be easy to do. But you have, the IAEA chief, like I said, Grossi stepping in and saying, we shouldn't even try this until the new government takes power. Well, if you don't get the deal done by then, the U.S. can make a lot of provocations, and so can Israel in that interim. And if they don't get a deal done by the time Rossi comes into power, it'll make it even that much more difficult, and they can always blame it on, well, we tried, but the new government is in power, and that's the problem. So I also heard that the French junior foreign minister said to their parliament that it's not looking good. Like the talks in Vienna, we might have to make some tough decisions soon, which I'm not sure what that means exactly, except that maybe they might abandon the talks. They're in the 6th round now. We're still at an impasse because, like I said, Biden refuses to lift these Trump-era sanctions. There was a report about how the Iranian Rouhani's chief of staff had come out and said that the U.S. is planning lifting well over, I think, 1,040 some sanctions out of the 1,500 that Trump imposed off of Iranian shipping, oil, and insurance sectors. And then we had I don't know if it was Ned Price or a State Department spokesman anyway. I don't think it was Ned Price, who came out and said to Reuters, that's not true. These were like rough draft type ideas, and nothing is agreed upon until everything is agreed upon. Just once again, throwing cold water on the idea. Now, I don't know if Iran was trying to put that idea out to sort of get things going. That could have been some of the details that are being worked out in the talks there in Vienna, but again, that doesn't look good. That the Biden administration is just denying that was ever even a real consideration.
So I do want to say I've had this feeling too that it could be a little bit of the Biden administration is trying to make sure the Israel lobby, the Saudis, the Republicans have no ammunition, because this is going to be a months-long process, and the Biden administration is like, we're moving closer to a deal, closer to a deal, then the entire time the Republicans are going to be shrieking about it. But if you keep saying we're, not that close or not that, you know what I mean? I could
Yeah.
see it a little bit of politics that way. But Connor, you had this article you sent me on some polling that was pretty interesting. And so I figured you could let us round out here on some good news. And let's talk about what American voters are feeling about Israel.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was actually glad to see this, very glad to see this. A progressive polling firm called Data for Progress uh, actually during from May 12th to the 25th, they conducted a poll where they surveyed about 2,100 voters, likely voters. This would have been during the latest war on Gaza. They've bombed it since, of course, you covered with Will on the show since Bennett took power. But nevertheless, this was held during the worst part really of that slaughter. And they asked American voters, because I don't think it's ever spelled out so explicitly to people. They just say, do you support Israel's right to exist, or whatever, the usual Hasbara to try and paint, murdering children and demolishing people's homes and the apartheid state and the annexations and all this stuff as just self-defense or whatever. But they asked him point blank, would you support or oppose a bill that would stop Israel from spending U.S. taxpayer dollars on the military detention of Palestinian children, the seizure or destruction of Palestinian property and homes, or support for Israel's annexation of Palestinian territory? 55% of respondents said they would support it, and 29% said they would oppose it. Democrats were far more inclined to restrict the aid. 72% favored this hypothetical bill. 57% of independents did, and only 36% of Republicans supported the bill. But I don't know, maybe I was disappointed to see that. But it's, I guess, to be expected with the Republicans. But that's still very good news. I think having Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and some of the good work that elements in the squad have done, especially during this last war, is having a positive effect. And actually, Representative Betty McCollum introduced a bill in April. She's a Democrat from Minnesota that basically is kind of similar to this idea. It would require the State Department and the General Accounting Office to issue reports to Congress on how Israel spends U.S. aid, but it doesn't have any enforcement mechanisms to ensure compliance. So, I mean, I appreciate that she's doing this, but I'm for cutting aid entirely to Israel. But if that's not an option, then I'm against all foreign aid, but especially to states like Israel, for instance, that are just mass murdering children. But I was surprised to see that J Street and Americans for Peace now are backing the bill, and so I think that's actually pretty good news. I'll take it. We don't get it that often.
Yeah, no, it's great to point that out, Connor, and thank you so much for coming back on the show. Everybody, check out the Libertarian Institute to find all my and Connor's work. And Connor, tell people where they can follow you on social media.
Always a pleasure. You guys can all can follow me at Freeman's Mind 96 on Twitter.
All right.
And all my stuff is up at the Libertarian Institute as well.
Thanks, Connor.
Thank you.